Hi, I'm Mad Mike.
And I'm Furious Phil. We're not a couple shiny, happy people holding hands.
No, we're not a couple of pacifists. We think it's time for Canada to wake up. The world needs a management change.
Help us reach critical mass. Check out the link below.
Hi, welcome to Mad Mike and Furious Phil. I'm Mike Rivet, and this is my co-host,
Phil Torres.
We'd like to welcome you today. We're talking about all things marijuana. I'm going to introduce our guest, Mr. Chad Cooke.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Welcome. Can you give us a little bio on yourself, Chad? Kind of let us know where you've been in the past few years.
Well, basically, I got involved in the medical marijuana movement in 1999, 2000. Felt a need for people to have access to marijuana as medicine. Started off with the Toronto Compassion Center. Quickly found myself becoming the media and public representative and doing a lot of interviews on news and stuff like that, because at the time the movement was really gaining momentum, and that's where I got my start.
Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've done in the field, politically and socially?
Wow. Well, like I said, I really worked for 3 compassion centers over the past 16 years that I've been doing this. Started with the Toronto Compassion Center, worked for CCMC and Section 56. Basically, my role was to educate, whether it was individuals who are coming to marijuana for the first time as a medicine, to giving talks to different organizations, the MS Society, Arthritis Society of Canada, CAMH, and also I had the pleasure of working with Professor Alan Young, Osgoode Hall Law professor and a lawyer of some note, in particular of this issue, and also people may know him from the efforts to legalize prostitution in Canada. So I was fortunate enough to give talks to his 4th-year law students as well. So my main role was in education, and my mantra at the time was really about normalization. There was a huge proponent of the movement was we're high, we're here, get used to it, which really focused more on the recreational use. And they had their place. They made great sound bites. I think a little bit too much focus on the news of, particularly young people smoking their bongs and their joints and the different marijuana marches and things like that. I wanted to differentiate myself from that and the people I worked for from that. Again, talking about normalization, trying to get to the sector of the public who really, through misinformation and fear-mongering had this tremendous misconception about the validity of marijuana as medicine, and further that, to lessen the evils that were perceived about it as a recreational substance. So that was my main goal, and it just sort of took on a life of its own, and I had some great opportunities and met great people over the past 16 years, and I find myself now sort of as more of a consultant on this issue, and I have 2 partners, and we're developing a cream right now. So that's where I find myself right now. But I was there. I mean, there's a lot of people that were involved in this movement, a lot of people who made a difference in this movement. We're kind of really now at the point where there's public acceptance. I think the last poll, roughly 70% or more of Canadians want it legalized, which is a huge number. I mean, if we had a referendum tomorrow about it, it would be legal. So there's not so much about the education so much, because there's so much information online. People, if they want the information, they can find it, because all the work's been done, the groundwork's been laid. Really now it's about further research into it, into the different cannabinoids and what they can do medicinally for people, and just to make people realize that it's a viable commodity. It can have a tremendously positive impact on our economy. It can produce a lot of jobs. So I think that's where we're at now, and I think that's where you'll find in North America. That's pretty much where, a lot of the news has been coming out of the States, where, and Colorado was the first state to legalize it.
Utah and Colorado.
Millions and millions.
Would that not work for us? Would that same logic not work,
Yeah. Oh, for sure. It's kind of funny that the nation that was famous for the war on drugs isn't actually, surpassing Canada in in legalizing marijuana as a commercial product, where there's not an issue anymore of recreational or medicinal use. The people who are going to use it medicinally know it works for them. They know what they need. They're going to do that. The people who use it recreationally, even though there's always a little bit of a facet of medicinal use, I think for the recreational user, it's a moot point. We know it's not going to have a negative impact on society. Society is not going to crumble if marijuana is legalized. Alcohol has been a legal narcotic in our society for a long time, and it's way more of a detriment, and it hasn't caused the fall of society. So marijuana most definitely won't. But yeah, no, I mean, it's potentially a bigger industry than wheat and lumber combined. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that's just ready and waiting to be utilized. I mean, right now there's commercial growers in Canada, but that's a misnomer. They're commercial producers, but only for medicinal use. So it's a very small portion of the population.
Well, let's talk about a little bit of Canada's commercial growers. Can you tell me a little bit about where we're at?
Well, prior to the commercial growers program, there was the MMAR. It was an exemption program, but it was more for the individual. Health Canada was producing the marijuana through Prairie Plant Systems. They had contracted Prairie Plant Systems to grow this marijuana. It was substandard product. It was grown in an abandoned nickel mine in Flin Flon, Manitoba. It was heavily subsidized by the taxpayer, and most exemptees really didn't order it, didn't utilize it. Either they grew for themselves because there was a part of the program where they could grow their own medicine, or they went to compassion centers, what I mentioned before where I worked. And a lot of the court challenges at that time were about the validity of compassion centers in producing and providing the medicine to people, because collectively they had the knowledge about strain selection, cannabinoids and THC and different methods of delivery for harm reduction, so like edibles, tinctures, and all the work had been done within the community. There was no cost to the taxpayer like this heavily subsidized program, and they were just reluctant to take that final step and saying, yes, compassion centers should be licensed and regulated. So after a decade more of fighting, they eventually found that Alan Young was a proponent in this, just that the exemption program at the time was unconstitutional. So people who were seeking to have access to it medicinally weren't getting that access. So instead of regulating compassion centers, which they should have done, they scrapped the exemption program and created the commercial licensing program that we have today. But there's still a lot of problems with it. Access is still a huge problem because there isn't a physical location where people can go, like a compassion center, and look at the medicine, test it if they want. They still have to order it online, wait however long it takes for it to get to them in the mail, pay a delivery charge. A lot of people, it's not economically viable for them because they're on disability. So I mean, it's a step sort of forward in the right direction. But there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, eventually it should just be legalized, and these companies, essentially is what they are, who have been approved for commercial production for medicinal use, could just make that step to being a commercial producer for marijuana in general, and then have, sort of like an LCBO, but for marijuana, an MCBO, province to province. Let the provinces decide how they want to do it. That's the direction it really should go.
Okay, great. We're going to take a small break and segue into part 2. Thanks a lot. And here we are back again with Chad. Chad, would you care to share any stories of your own and deploy the fight for legalization?
There's quite a few. One that kind of stands out in my mind, this was early 2000s, I'm going to say around 2002, and the Supreme Court of Ontario just recently made a ruling that compassion centers were a viable source of medicine. They should be regulated and licensed, and the Ontario government wasn't doing well. The federal government was sticking to their guns with the federal program, but the provincial governments weren't doing anything to make any kind of change and to acknowledge the hard work that compassion centers have done. So Anne McClellan, who at one time was the Deputy Prime Minister, she was a Minister of Health at the time in Ontario, And they were convening one of the first meetings of provincial ministers of health to address, province to province issues with healthcare. They're having this meeting at the Royal York Hotel. We were aware of this at TCC and that, so we went down to, protest the meeting and kind of draw some media attention to the medical marijuana issue. So there was a small group of us, maybe half a dozen or so, and it was in one of the conference rooms, the meeting of the health ministers. And not all the health ministers there, but Anne McClellan was there. They were teleconferencing with the BC health minister at the time, and there was a lot of press. And we were in the hallway outside the room where they were having the press conference. So, we had talked about how we were gonna, get more of exposure. So I volunteered to attempt to get into the press conference. So I walked up to the door, and they had the press secretary who was, responsible for letting various media people in, and had their little clipboard there with everyone listed. And I basically bullshitted my way in. I said that I was with this magazine and I should be on the list. My editor had called last minute to arrange for me to be here. Didn't mention anything about marijuana. And, I was very persistent and persuasive, and she said that, she needed to ask someone a question about it, and, can she get right back to me? So she walked off into the room, and I took the opportunity to just slide in, and I walked up slinked kind of up the middle aisle, because they had press on each side in chairs, and I went right up to the front row, sat myself down. It was beside Mike Duffy, who, disgraced senator right now, but at the time he was a newscaster for CTV News. And City TV was there, CBC, everyone was there. So press conference commences. Anne McClellan is standing up there, talking about different issues. And different people from the press are going to be asking questions, and there's a momentary lull. And you understand, I'm alone in this room with what I'm going to do. All my cohorts are out in the hallway. I'm sure not believing that I've actually got in there and wishing they could know what I was going to say. So there was a momentary lull, no press were asking questions. So I stood up in front of the mic, and Anne McClellan had sat back down, and I can't remember the gentleman who was standing up at the podium, but I just shot off a question. I said, I just want to know how the Ontario government views the recent court ruling at the Supreme Court of Ontario stating that compassion centers are a viable source of medicine, and how is it that the Ontario government can be basically in contempt of court and not adhering to that ruling? And the gentleman said, I think I'm going to pass this question on to Minister McClellan, who's exactly who I wanted to answer it. And so she stood up, and she looked right at me, and she said, I'm not going to comment on your assertions at this time. And I went, oh, okay. So I turned around, I marched out, kind of slammed the door open, went outside, and it was like a count of 3. All the other media people came out behind me, and as soon as I came out, my cohorts, we had some signs that we had made. We're all there with signs, Camera guys came out, Mike Duffy came out and patted me on the back. At the time, I was proud of this. I mean, knowing what he did now, not so much. But at the time, he's like, you know more than all of those politicians in there combined. And, good on you. And it was like, great. Now, the strangest thing about this whole thing was they really, I don't know who they contacted right quickly, but it was quick because these 2 individuals who are quite large, who stated they were with hotel security. They were not with hotel security. They had the white little, earpieces in. They were clearly RCMP, ushered us out of the hotel, and which it then became a very kind of heated thing on the street, because we were on the actual street. These 2 RCMP guys were on the sidewalk, and a few other people had shown up to this just protest in the making, and one of them was an exemptee by the name of Stephen Bacon, and he proceeded to pull out quite a large joint, lighted up, and I'll never forget this, was just blowing smoke in the face of these 2 RCMP undercover guys, just egging them on. And these guys were being nasty. They were like threatening to kick our ass, and they're like, just step on this sidewalk, we're gonna kick your ass. unbeknownst to them, the whole thing was being filmed. So, I mean, that was kind of like a victory day for us because we maintained our cool. Aside from well, he maintained his cool. What he did was pretty ballsy, but he was within his legal rights. He was an exemptee. He was allowed to smoke marijuana, and there's no law that I know about blowing smoke in the face of an undercover RCMP officer who's threatening to kick your ass. But anyways, it played into our hands, and it was one of the better days because it really showed, what we were talking about made sense, and just the ridiculousness of the government not, and also them not having to comply with an Ontario Supreme Court ruling. I mean, if that was me or you, we'd be in contempt of court. We'd potentially go to jail. But being the government, they could ignore it. So, things really started to gain momentum after that point, I think, because the media really started to focus on it as well. Yeah.
What do you think, roughly, the average, let's say, Torontonian, stressful city, different walks of life, a lot of professionals. What would you guess, or do you have a number on the average person that likes their recreational use? Is that a vague question?
It's not vague at all. No. You know what? It's one of those things as a recreational substance that crosses generations, economic. People were much quieter about it at the time, especially if they were professionals. I mean, I can't tell you how many professionals I knew who were recreational users or medicinal users. They had arthritis or something like that, but they had to maintain anonymity because at the time they could lose their job. Some were teachers. Some were lawyers who weren't as open about it as Professor Alan Young. Some were, in corrections or law enforcement. They had to be very quiet about it. Professional boxer, I orientated. It's another thing. I was membership coordinator. Razor Ruddock was one of our our patients, and I had the pleasure of meeting him and his wife. And
what was wrong with him?
Orientated. He had arthritis from years of boxing. Severe arthritis, and he didn't smoke it. He ate brownies, and they worked fantastic for him. We had some high-profile people at the time that we had to keep very quiet about. There was also a lot of firsts. Recently, CNN did a big report on children suffering, and really, I'm so sorry that I can't remember the name of the seizure disorder, but it's a very serious form of epilepsy where they have.
I know of the story.
Yeah, they have. It's very debilitating. They have countless seizures a day, and they've found this extract. It's basically hash oil, for lack of a better term.
It was hundreds of seizures, something.
Yeah, a day, and they're administering very small doses, like on the tongue, of this hash oil to these patients, and it's working better than any pharmaceutical medicine. Well, 2003, we just started making tinctures at the Toronto Compassion Center, and we had two parents come to me through the membership line, desperate for some sort of solution for their 10-year-old daughter who suffered from this disorder. Now, this was long before the CNN report. And, they had heard some rumblings about, that marijuana works well for epilepsy. Is there some potential or a method of delivery that, they were desperate. Their daughter, wasn't able to attend school. Being 10, there's obviously smoking, it was out of the question. Eating, it was out of the question. So we did a tincture, yeah. Now, a glycerin-based tincture. Marijuana the cannabinoids are soluble in either fat or alcohol. So glycerin is a form of fat. Obviously, we wanted to make this as least harmful, any kind of side effects as possible. So we didn't want to even give her any alcohol, even the small amount that would be contained within a tincture. So we did a glycerin-based tincture, and within 3 days of them administering it to their daughter, it was the same results that you saw in that CNN report. Like, her seizures were, more than half. They went from, let's say, 70 a day down to 5 a day. She was able to now think about going back to school, having kind of a life and build a life, and her parents, it was one of the more touching things too. There's a lot of those moments that I had, but this is one of the most emotional and touching because the gratitude that they had, that they felt that their child's life had been given back to her. A lot of tears, and then they became instrumental in the fight. They could say, look, we're giving our daughter this form of marijuana as medicine. It's the only thing that's working for her, without having to take these pharmaceuticals that don't actually work that well, and there's a whole host of side effects. it's a very viable medicine, and anecdotally you'd hear these stories over and over and over again, and now the science is starting to prove it. Right?
Let's take a minute here, Chad, before we break, and go over a list of some of the ailments that cannabis has been used to treat.
Most famously, what it was first known to really be effective for was chemotherapy. People going through chemotherapy for various cancers to combat the nausea, the wasting from said nausea. HIV/AIDS, huge benefit to that. It would, again, for wasting issues, it actually would allow patients to be able to take their pharmaceutical regimens, which were, 30 pills a day, a lot of experimental drugs at the time, AZTs and stuff like that were, almost akin to chemotherapy, that was like killing their body while keeping the HIV from turning into full-blown AIDS. But without the marijuana, they wouldn't have been able to take those medications, so they would have died. And we heard that over and over again. We quickly formed alliances with PWA and ACT right from the get-go, because within that community, they knew the benefits of marijuana and treating the symptoms of that debilitating illness. Arthritis is a big one. Any anti-inflammatory disorder really seems to benefit really well from cannabis. So psoriasis, eczema, arthritis, Crohn's disease, colitis. Hard pressed to find an illness that doesn't in some shape or form benefit from a facet of cannabis. Like, really, that's what makes it such a wonderful medicine, is that one thing can help almost every illness there is, or symptoms of almost every illness. You have different pharmaceutical drugs for every symptom, so thousands and thousands of different drugs. You have one thing, a plant, a natural product that we have receptors for, cannabinoid receptors. So we're meant to use it. We produce cannabinoids naturally in our bodies, but by supplementing those cannabinoids in higher doses, we can have these different anti-inflammatory effects, things like that. So some things, obviously, it's much more beneficial for. Other things, some mild relief, but for lack of a better term, I don't like throwing the term out like a wonder drug or anything like that, but it's a wonder plant. I mean, it's meant to be used by humans, Animals actually can benefit from it as well. We found that people would come with their pets, dogs that had arthritis and that. They were feeding them cannabis. It was working really, really well. So,
Brilliant.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Chad, for that little list. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. We're going to talk more with Chad about the future of the movement, where we're headed, where we're going. Welcome back. We're here with Chad Cooke, and we're talking about legalization of marijuana and all things marijuana. We're going to cover a little bit of the history that you may or may not know about Canadian marijuana. Marijuana has been prohibited in Canada for the last 90 years, and we're going to talk to Chad about a few of the reasons. I'll give you a few stats here, Chad, to work with. Between 2006 and 2012, in Canada, there were 405,000 marijuana-related arrests. That's up 41% from the previous 6 years, from 2000 to 2006. And in 2002, there was a Senate report for Canada that stated that law enforcement and the Justice Department spent $300 to $500 million on the fight against marijuana. Chad, what can you tell us a little bit about the history of the fight against marijuana?
Well, going back like 90 years, like fight against anything, it was really a lobby against marijuana. It came down to textile industry, oil and gas, lumber, hemp. And at that time, they grouped hemp and marijuana together. It was a perceived threat to all three of these industries. More recently, some of the statistics you cited there, I think it was a pushback to the gains that the movement had made in getting marijuana available medicinally, and the push to try and legalize it. So I think it was a pushback. The Conservative government also, they still seem to have an issue with cannabis. Whatever reason, I couldn't tell you, but we're falling behind our partners to the south there, who are the country of origin of the war on drugs. It's been in the news a lot about the different states legalizing it. And it needs to go in that direction here. Unfortunately, prohibition was money, basically, these groups lobbying. the future of legalization in the States is about money, and hopefully that will translate here to Canada. They'll see the economic viability of it. The commercial growers have shown that economic viability just for medicinal use. Tweed, which is one commercial grower in Smith Falls, it's trading on the TSX. It's worth over $100 million to date. So, I mean, and that's just for medicinal use. So, I mean, just imagine if it was straight up legalized and it was truly a commercial commodity. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that's the direction it has to go.
Fix a lot of roads, build a lot of schools.
The tax revenues alone would be huge. Think about the taxes they generate off of alcohol and tobacco, are massive. And a lot more people, I think, now smoke marijuana than smoke cigarettes, to be honest. It's better for you.
Seems people are less angry by that fact. And, smelling it. Like in Toronto, I bike everywhere. And if a day goes by where I don't smell pot someplace, I'm very surprised.
It's true. It's true.
It's just, and it seems like I don't smell cigarette smoke that much anymore, which is a good thing.
No, it's not demonized so much as it used to be because they can no longer misinform the public about marijuana. I mean, the jury's out. It's not a gateway drug. It's not chemically addictive.
It doesn't leave cigarette butts. That's another one, actually.
No, it does not.
Sherbourne is a sad state of affairs.
Yeah.
It just, after all the melt, everyone's glad.
It's the worst time of year for that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That should be a smoking ad right there,
Yeah, no, I agree. No, it's the time has come, like really, especially younger generation. I mean, I don't think there's anyone under 30 really who has an issue with marijuana. I mean, whether they smoke it or not, they know people that smoke it, family members that smoke it. It's really kind of a no-brainer, and it can be a cash grab for those capitalists in this all who want to make money off something. It's a huge industry waiting to be tapped, for sure. Yeah.
It seems like there's room for everybody, too,
Oh, yeah, there's still a lot of innovation to happen. And the research has exploded over the last decade because the money's there. And, the sky's the limit, really. There's a lot of products. It's actually superseded hemp now. Hemp had its heyday, as a renewable resource for paper and clothing and everything. It seemed to have fallen kind of by the wayside. It's still a very viable product in itself, environmentally friendly and such, but recreational cannabis, marijuana, has overshadowed it for sure. So hopefully maybe that will bring the whole discussion about the whole plant, be it the hemp strain and the marijuana strain, because there's a lot of potential still to be tapped for sure.
What is it about hemp? I find for me, I use a hand lotion that's hemp. I had a lot of trouble with just knuckles cracking and even my lips. And anytime I used hemp, it's right away.
Yeah, no, it's just a really, really good fat, basically. It's one of the earliest cultivated crops. It's been around for thousands of years. The Chinese were the ones to first identify the medicinal properties of hemp, even. Hemp oil, as we know, is a very good source of fat. It comes back to the fact that we have cannabinoid receptors in our body. It's a product that should be used and utilized to its fullest, 100%. And we're finally coming to that realization, I think. The rest of the world is already on that bandwagon. In a lot of countries in Europe, they, are far ahead of us. Spain, for instance, is very far ahead. It's been legal there for a while now. There's a few other countries, Belgium and other places.
Portugal.
Portugal.
It's been about 12 years for
Yeah,
Portugal.
and there's in the past what they would say is like if you legalize any drug, in particular cannabis, it's going to lead our youth to use more drugs, and it's going to be the decline of society, which we touched upon. The opposite is shown to be true, actually. Yeah. Make it a non-taboo subject, then it loses that allure. It's kids now can get can get marijuana easier than alcohol, and I'd much rather, I'm not condoning excessive marijuana use in teenagers. There are some issues about, the developing brain and excessive use of marijuana, but I'd much rather have, the youth experimenting with marijuana than with alcohol. I mean, no one's died ever from the use of marijuana, and plenty of people have died from the use of alcohol. So, again, it's a
Legal,
no-brainer.
taxable drug.
Yeah, 100%. It's a no-brainer, and the time is now. I mean, especially in this economic climate. I mean, we need something that's going to generate that kind of tax revenue that's there, and there's not a lot of legwork to be done anymore. The infrastructure's there, and again, it hasn't been done on the backs of the taxpayers. That's another thing that people should really look at. There's like a zero to no cost to the taxpayers for any of this. It's just, regulating it, writing the legislation, and away we go.
Let's talk a little bit, Chad, about the product you're developing.
A cream, basically a topical application. I mentioned that the cannabinoids, the active medicinal ingredients, is soluble in either fat or alcohol. So making a cream, basically, you use a fat base, be it coconut oil or glycerin. And the cream I'm developing, I first developed it to deal with arthritis and psoriasis. It's just shown to be effective for a myriad of issues. Again, it's another option for people who don't want to smoke it. Who want to move away from corticosteroids, steroid creams, which, are good for short-term use, but prolonged use, they have a whole host of side effects. Again, there's no side effects from use of a cream at all. And also, a child could apply this cream. There are lots of children with severe psoriasis, eczema, and you don't really want a child using a steroid-based cream. So it's really viable for that. It's even worked. I'm going to throw this out here because it's something I've never would have expected. But people who suffer from the herpes virus, it supposedly really works for the onset of a herpes outbreak, a flare-up, I should say. It kind of stops it. That's what I've been told from some patients who have used it. So it kind of has the potential to replace a lot of other medicines. So hopefully go to clinical trial soon and get approval, do a double-blind study. Expect some opposition from Big Pharma, of course. Mm-hmm. They seem to have been the biggest lobby against marijuana. And again, it comes down to money, but for them, it's losing billions of dollars. People using their synthetic medicines because they can't patent marijuana. It's a living organism. So, they're desperately trying to synthesize specific cannabinoids, but in the past, it's been shown any synthetic cannabinoids they have developed, they're just not as effective as the real thing and not as effective as the whole plant method of delivery, which is utilizing all the cannabinoids together. There's 60 of them. So, you can't just isolate them and expect them to work as well as when there's certain magic that we can't duplicate that nature has, done over millions of years, basically, probably, in the development of this plant. So, I'm confident it's going to happen. I mean, as the research comes out more and more, and again, it comes down to money, and the money is there to be made for sure. Yeah.
We wish you all the luck in your endeavors, Chad.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming down and spending some time.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. On behalf of Mad Mike and Furious Phil, I'd like to say thanks for tuning in and watching us, and we'll be back to see you shortly.